Hello, this is going to cover Chapter 4 in Sociology, which includes socialization, behavior, and influence. So, we need to start off with some definitions. Each of us, play a role in our lives, and this is the expected behavior in society based on your social status. So, for example, if you are a wealthy doctor, you are expected to act one way, whereas if you are a homeless person, you are expected to act a different way. In terms of how we expect people to behave, comes into the idea of socialization. And this is how people learn the expectations of society. So, for example, if you think about you and your friends, people tend to dress the same, speak in a similar way, have very similar opinions. And part of it is shaping us, and the other part of it is we seek out people that we feel a kinship with, that we feel we can, get along with. And the reason that we seek people out like this is we're looking for people who are like ourselves, who have a similar identity. And this is how you define yourself. It is learned through socialization, in other words, how others see us, plus our own personality. Now, personality is a person's relatively, and relative is, it doesn't always, it's not 100%, but it's relatively consistent pattern of behavior, feelings, beliefs, and likes. So some of the relatively consistent behaviors include things like, are you somebody who likes to take risks or take the opportunity to try new things? Are you somebody who is very quiet and shy or somebody who's very extroverted? Another element can be how flexible you are, how easy you are to work with. Some people are just a giant pain in the butt all the time. Other people are just the easiest people in the world to work with, and that is part of our personality. We also have something called learned internalized behaviors. When someone learns behavior so well, they become internalized. So think about brushing your teeth. You don't have to think, oh, I have to brush my teeth a specific way, or tie my shoe in the morning. You're not thinking about which loop goes over what loop. It's something you can do automatically. And that's what it means when it becomes learned internalized behaviors. This means that behaviors are normal to a person or a society. And so, for example, if you think of it in a negative way, being a racist, if mom and dad are racists, you surround yourself with people who are also racist, well, being racist becomes the norm. However, and this is one of those things where experiences can change the way you evolve in by just being exposed to certain groups. So, if you are someone who is racist, but you are put in a situation where you have to work closely with someone from a minority group, you may see them for who they are and not some monolithic group of people. And that's really the key here to all prejudice, is that you cannot look at anyone as one giant group. You have to think of them as an individual, because you may have somebody who just doesn't fit into any of the stereotypes. And yet, they are oftentimes stereotyped just for the color of their skin or their national origin. We also have to look at something called nature versus nurture. Nature is the idea of inborn traits. These are things that we're born with. Versus nurture, and these are the traits we learn through interacting with others, in other words, socialization. And for many years, it was thought that it was a versus situation, nature versus nurture. But in recent years, researchers have realized that it's not a versus scenario. Instead, people are deeply influenced by both nature and nurturing. So instead, we call this the biopsychosocial model of health, and it represents the biology, the psychology, which is also cognition or how we think. In other words, some people have a very happy-go-lucky perspective, other people have a very morose perspective. and then also our social interactions. And here's a little Venn diagram to kind of give you some perspective on what all of these things mean. Another element to understand is the concept of social control and conformity. Social control is how a group or individual is brought into conformity with the dominant group. And we had talked about social sanctions in a previous chapter, but social control is less severe. This is if you wear a type of jeans that your friends think are cheap or not cool, they're going to make fun of you or say comments that will make you feel bad about the pants you're wearing. And of course, then you will, go to the store and buy the pants that are socially sanctioned by your group. We learn through our experiences that deviation from social norms can result in ridicule, peer pressure, and social judgment. So, a lot of times in high school, especially, you see people who conform a great deal to their social group because really that's the only opportunity for socialization they have. As people get older, the conformity is still there, but it's not as stressed in terms of peer pressure. Instead, you have personal expectations that you put on yourself. If you're pregnant, you want to be the best mom or best dad ever, and you start putting expectations on yourself based on what society sees as a great mom or a great dad. Now we're going to look at specific agents of socialization. And what I mean by that is these are the specific mechanisms that shape who we are as individuals. The first one, and probably the most significant, is our family. This is the first group to define the expectations for a child. And parents play a crucial role in how a child develops their sense of self. So, if a parent is very supportive and enthusiastic about trying new things, that's going to shape the child a particular way. Interestingly, children within the same family may experience different expectations based on gender or birth order. Now, in terms of gender, it might be the expectation that the little girls help mom in the kitchen and the little boys help dad outside mowing the lawn. However, it depends on the family expectations. Some families try to be as gender neutral as possible, while others follow very strict gender lines. Now, in terms of birth order, we look at four major categories: firstborns, middle children, lastborn, or the baby of the family, and only children. So your firstborns, very high achieving, very mature, very responsible, they tend to obey the rules. These folks, because they are the firstborn, are given the most attention the first couple years of their life until their sibling comes along, but also they become another parent in the household because what happens as they get a little bit older, hey, watch your little brother or sister, keep an eye on your brother or sister, share your toys with your brother or sister. So they end up having to be a mature, responsible person at a very young age. So they tend to take that on. Middle children, way more easygoing and relaxed. They tend to be very good peacemakers. They can negotiate the peace. But they're also very secretive because these are kids that don't ever have anything of their own. They get a lot of hand-me-downs from their older siblings, and then they have to hand their stuff down to the next child. So they tend to be very secretive about what they do and they hide things. So it's a very interesting context. Baby of the family tends to be more outgoing, very creative. They are used to being pampered and they have a pretty good sense of humor. So these three categories will, in a large part, define who you are as a person. Firstborns tend to be in professional careers like doctor, lawyer, accountant, professor. Middle children tend to go into the social sciences like psychology, social work, sociologists. And the baby of the families tend to go into more of creative occupations like architecture or interior design. Then you have your only children, the only child of the family, and they are, again, almost like a third adult without having the responsibility of a child that they have to look after. They're mature, they're responsible, they are close to their parents, they're very demanding, and they're very private. So, dating someone who is an only child can be very challenging for somebody who's grown up with siblings. Another agent of socialization is the mass media. And this influences the values we form, our image of society, our goals, and our relationships with others. So, in terms of how we see the world, we see it through the lens of what we've seen on television. So, for example, media violence. It is estimated that the average person turning 18 has seen approximately 18,000 simulated murders on TV. And they're often in a humorous way or without serious consequences. And, my favorite example of this is, oh no, we killed Kenny on South Park. And Kenny is back every week. So, as a child or as an adult, it desensitizes us to violence. And oftentimes it can lead to a lack of empathy for the victims of violence. Then we have our peers, and these are people with whom you interact on equal terms, such as friends, classmates, coworkers. Now, some environments are so dominated by one particular group that the minority group has to create their own affiliation. So you think of careers for women that are very rare, engineering, for example. I have a friend of mine who's a nuclear engineer, and she's pretty much been the only woman on staff for a really long time. Other jobs that you wouldn't necessarily think are female, such as being nurses, more and more men are entering the field because it's lucrative. They don't have to spend as much time in college as a doctor does, and they are also fulfilling their need to offer health care. But in some of these subgroups that develop, they can form their own power base. So, for example, the African American caucus in our United States Congress has a pretty good voting bloc. They can be very powerful because they can promise a certain number of votes to whoever's trying to get a bill passed. So it brings not just a social support, but also a power support to one another. Then we have cliques. And these are a circle of friends where members identify with each other and hold a sense of common identity. And they are formed based on a sense of exclusive membership. It has to be exclusive or it's not a clique. It's just a group. They contain an internal hierarchy with certain members having higher status and more power than others. So again, and I have a picture here of from the movie Mean Girls, is that you have to feel like your group has an exclusivity in order for it to be a viable clique, because otherwise, anybody can join and then it's not special. Another agent of socialization is religion, and religious instruction contributes greatly to the identities that children construct for themselves. Religion provides guidelines about how to organize your life, what is moral behavior, what are the roles of men and women, how to rear your children, and the role of sexuality in a relationship. So, for example, if you're Roman Catholic, you're not supposed to have sex until after you get married, and then you're not allowed to use birth control. So, that's significantly different than a lot of religions nowadays. But a lot of people will bend the rules or cherry pick which rules to follow based on the experiences they had growing up. It is rare for a person to reject the essential beliefs and values of their family. They may go away for a while, they may think about practicing a different religion or practicing no religion, but the values that are taught through the religion tend to stick with the person. Another really interesting agent of socialization is sports. And this often defines how people see gender and gender roles. especially when it comes to a person's level of competitiveness. So, if you have, as a child or a young adult, engaged in sports, you're probably a very competitive person, which is great because competitive people tend to be more successful in life. Other values it can impact include your work ethic, your sense of fair play, and attitudes towards winning and losing. Anybody who's played a team sport knows that sometimes you are going to lose and it's a horrible feeling. So you work really hard as a team to win. But it's also something that you begin to realize happens, and you have to be a good loser as well as a good winner. For many men, playing or watching sports is how they developed and maintained a relationship with their fathers or sons or brothers. It's something that they can talk about, something that they can fight about, something that they can agree on. More importantly, it creates a bond between the father and the son or athletes that's considered safe, because male relationships that are based on emotions outside of sports are often perceived in a very homophobic way. So if you see two guys um, chest bumping each other, you may, in a non sports context, wonder if they're dating. On the other hand, you see two football players chest bump, they're celebrating something, even though they're still rubbing their chest against somebody else's chest. Women who participate in sports have many benefits, and they develop a strong sense of bodily competence, self confidence, willingness to take risks, goal setting and attainment, and they seek out challenges. They're confident in their body, they're confident in what they can do with their body, they're not ashamed of their body, which is a huge transition from how many women in society look at themselves. And more women don't engage in sports a lot of times because they're afraid of being called unwomanly or masculine. And they are ridiculed by their peers for their strength and competitiveness because the gender stereotype of women is dependence and passivity. Luckily and thankfully, in the last 20 years or so, this has been quickly, or even faster than average, changing, because women now are very interested in cross training. They're interested in maintaining the muscle tone in their bodies, and gyms have really opened up for women to explore their options as opposed to those old, dark, disgusting gyms that only men went to. Another agent of socialization is school. When kids enter school, influence and behavioral expectations shift from the parents to the teachers and classmates. So, there's a few research items that have been uncovered over the years. One, boys receive more attention from their teachers than girls do. Two, teachers perceive a connection between a socioeconomic status and intelligence, meaning that they perceive rich kids as being more intelligent and poor kids as being less intelligent. And the same thing goes for their behavior. They see poor kids as troublemakers and they see rich kids as well behaved. And, we all know that that's not always the case. Again, we see how stereotyping can be very negative to a group of people. Men are referenced much more often in textbooks as being successful in government and culture. And if you look through the textbooks, it would almost seem like women didn't exist in a lot of ways. And yet, for people who really understand history and culture, they know that despite the fact women not having a lot of opportunities up until the middle of the 1900s, women were still kicking butt and taking names. So you have people like Joan of Arc, you have Boudicca, you have Cleopatra. These are women who were strong, fierce warriors. And yet we don't really focus on them at all when we teach history. We're far more interested in somebody like Alexander the Great or Caesar, or even going into the more modern era when we're talking about World War II with Hitler and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, ignoring the fact that Eleanor Roosevelt was actually instrumental in making sure that the public didn't know that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had lost the ability to walk at some point. Last thing on the slide is about a concept called self-fulfilling prophecies. And this is when expectations cause behavior. Therefore, if someone is expected to be a loser, then they subconsciously change their behavior and become a loser to fulfill that expectation. And it can also work in the more positive way. If you always tell your child that they are very smart and you praise them whenever they come home with an academic accomplishment, they are going to believe that they are smart and they are going to pursue academics in a much more serious way. In 2003, Annette LaRue published a groundbreaking study on the socioeconomic status of children. And her findings included middle class children live very structured lives and are engaged in multiple activities but have far less unstructured playtime. Poor children led much less structured lives with much fewer activities but more playtime. So what is a structured activity? Structured activity includes things like going to tennis lessons, going to Little League, playing in Pop Warner, going to piano lessons, going to dance lessons, going to any kind of organized activity that the child does on a regular basis. And as such, poor kids, their families often can't afford to send them to these clubs. So what LaRue says in this is that poor children, they have a more relaxed lifestyle and are less stressed out, implying that middle class kids have a very structured, high stress environment as they're growing up. And, is that a bad thing or a good thing? And it depends. But it really makes a major difference when the child becomes older, because all of those things that they've been exposed to as a middle class child, they know what they're really good at and they know what they're not good at, so they can focus their attention more. Middle class parents engage in concerted cultivation of their children, meaning that they made deliberate and sustained effort to stimulate children's development and to cultivate their cognitive and social skills. So if you think of it in terms of planting a garden, and every week you're out there, you pick the weeds, you water it, you give it nutrients, and at the end of the growing season, you're going to have this amazing crop of whatever you're growing. On the other hand, poor children experience what's known as natural growth, meaning they develop without structure but experience more creativity. So this is you're driving along, you decide you're going to stop and go hiking, and you're hiking through the woods and you come across this little area of flowers and it's just gorgeous, and it looks like it just, seeds got blown in by the wind and they're all haphazard, but it's such a creative, beautiful little stretch of ground on your hike. And it's, again, natural growth. Middle class children develop a more individualized self concept and a sense of entitlement, meaning they know they're good and they want you to treat them like they're awesome. Whereas poor and working class children have a hard time negotiating their way through various social institutions effectively. So, for example, you see that poor and working class kids have a hard time applying for college. They don't understand the process. They don't understand how financial aid works. They don't understand how to sign up for the SATs. So they require a lot more support within the institutional goal of attending college, rather than somebody who comes from a middle class household and has parents who are going to walk them through the process. LaRue's findings ultimately tell us that these children, and she's talking about both poor and middle class, are being socialized to take their place in the socioeconomic class they were born into. So, what LaRue is saying is that most of us are being raised to stay where we are. And it is the parents who go beyond and above or, really slack off that the child can not grow up to the social economic status that they grew up in. Now, we're going to be looking next at aging and how this affects socialization. So, socialization begins the moment a person is born, and we're going to look at four specific um, time periods: childhood, adolescence, which is your teen years, adulthood, and then old age. So, childhood. This is when we establish our initial identity and values vis a vis our family. The family is the primary influence. Gender socialization begins with the terms used to describe different gendered babies. So, little girls are often called sweet or beautiful. Little boys are called strong or handsome. And we dress them even right out of the womb. They get a little hat. And if there's a pink ribbon on the hat, that means it's a little girl. If it's a little boy ribbon or a little blue ribbon, then we know it's a little boy. So from the minute they are born, they are being socialized in certain directions. Girls tend to be more protected than boys by their parents. Girls have less freedom to roam, so to speak. And games and play teach children intellectual, social, and interpersonal skills, especially when they start engaging in make believe play, where, they play house or they play doctor, and it's just begins to give them the perspective of what it is to be somebody else. Now, games that are competitive encourage a lifelong value of being competitive, and we talked about this with sports. Boys tend to engage in group play that is rough and involves specific rules, whereas girls tend to engage in conversational play that is based on social relationships. And think about it, little girls, they can play with a Barbie, and this is how you play Barbie. You figure out what outfit they're going to wear, you figure out what vehicle, whether it's her Corvette or her RV or her airplane, she's going to sit in. And then you have a little skit that they work out. And then you put her in a new outfit. So a lot of it is just this idea of, when you play Barbie, you're trying on different identities in a sense. Children are also very influenced by the adults around them, especially in terms of mimicking their behaviors. In a positive way, a child will see mommy and daddy interact and how much they love each other and cuddle. And when they grow up, they know that that's normal in a relationship. Unfortunately, the negative is also true. People who abuse children are often abused when they were children. So it becomes this, chain of abuse. So it is, in a positive way and a negative way. And it becomes part of the values and beliefs about behavior. Then we move on to adolescence, which again is your teen years. And this is your formation of a consistent identity. This is where you kind of figure out who you are. Whether you're goth, whether you're a jock, whether you're the cheerleader, whether you're the nerd, whether you're the theater geek. All of these terms basically are stereotypes of an identity. The main goal at this time period for a lot of teenagers is to separate from their families. They strive for independence. And I'm not talking about physically, but emotionally. They rely on their friends for emotional support. They don't tell their parents very much. And some kids are better at this than others. Some kids hide everything from their parents. Other kids tend to, have a much more open relationship with their family. So it depends on the family. The tension of adolescence is that they, meaning the teenagers, are expected to behave like adults, but they are denied any of the rights and privileges of being an adult. So, yeah, I'm expecting you to act like one, but I'm not giving you any breaks. So, you have to act like an adult, but you still have to be home by 11 o'clock tonight. And that does create a lot of tension because, being an adult means having a certain amount of autonomy or independence. And teenagers are often in a situation where they have to ask permission to use the restroom. They have to wait until a certain time to eat food. They have all of these restrictions that your average adult does not. Contrary to what most parents might think, the vast majority of adolescents are willing to work hard, have high expectations for their education or job prospects, and do not engage in criminal or violent behavior. And I say this because a lot of older people see teenagers as a stereotype. And again, you see this monolithic example in terms of a teenager who um, breaks windows, tries to steal a car, graffitis a house, and that's how we perceive all teenagers, when the reality is that they're a very small minority within the larger group of adolescents. Then we move into adulthood. This is the process where we learn new roles and expectations in the adult environment. We oftentimes have multiple demands, and they are often conflicting, that lead to the development of new priorities or social expectations. A prime example is when you have a child. So let's say that you are a college graduate, you've been working at a company or a hospital for 5 years, you decide to have a child, you get pregnant, you have your baby, and all of a sudden work doesn't seem as important as making sure that the baby grows up to be a good person. So your focus is no longer on being the best at your job, maybe. Instead, it's the focus on the child. And this is one of those things where you have to prioritize in your life what's important. The major transitions during adulthood include marriage, career changes, starting a family, getting a divorce, dealing with a long-term family illness or a death, and these all have the potential to transform a person's social identity. One of my best friends, she lost her husband when he was in his mid 40s. Um, he was killed by a drunk driver, and she was a really happy, funny person. And after his death, she became a very somber, quiet person. And this social identity that she had been, for 45 years suddenly changed dramatically. And again, why? Because she lost the love of her life, and it made her feel like the rest of her life is not going to be as much fun. Over the last 40 years, people are getting married later, having children later, and staying in school longer. The average age for a man to get married is around 28. The average age for a woman to get married is around 26. And if you go back to the 1970s, early 1970s, the ages were much, much earlier, 22 and 24. Then we move into old age. And the American society, we are taught to fear old age, and a tremendous amount of time and money is spent on delaying the aging process. So we get Botox, we go to the gym and we work out, we take all these vitamins, we get as much sleep as we can because that's the most helpful thing. So we try really hard to delay the onset of being elderly, but it's inevitable. The thing is, in the United States, we fear it, but in other countries, old age is seen as an accomplishment. So if you go, for example, to Japan, elderly people are seen in a much more positive light, bringing a wealth of experience and a lifetime of knowledge to a particular field. And they are embraced much more than in the United States. Going back to our sociological frameworks, in functionalism believes that the elderly practice what's called disengagement, where they withdraw from society and simultaneously are relieved of the responsibilities of society. So they literally disengage from society. Whereas conflict theorists believe that the young and the elderly are competing for the same resources, and it is the middle-aged who ultimately control these resources. And, it's to a certain extent, either one of these philosophies can be argued for or against, but the reality in this country is that if you look at who suffers the most in an economic situation, it's the young and the old. Those of us who are middle aged tend to ride out the bumps of economic problems much better. So we've talked about stereotypes, but I just want to kind of reassert the absurdity of stereotypes, which are preconceived judgments about what different groups are like. So we see young people as slackers, irresponsible, and sloppy, and we see elderly as forgetful, stubborn, and unproductive. Stereotypes reflect prejudice, and it is a way to show a group that they are inferior to the dominant group. Now, these two comics, I love both of these. So, two guys, I found this kitty, but I don't know if it's male or female. And the other guy says, well, there's only one way to find out. And the next panel, we have the cat behind the wheel of a car, and he or she is trying to parallel park it. And the cat guy says, come on, kitty, park. And the other guy is, park the car, kitty, park the car. And again, the idea here is a stereotype that women cannot parallel park. And it's just absurd. Because if you've ever gone into the city, you see an equal number of people parallel parking, male or female. It just depends on where you live. People who live in the suburbs don't have to parallel park very often. So that's more of a stereotype. And then this is one of my favorites, especially if you have a Dodge Ram. Nothing says manly like a Dodge Ram. And then if you look at the picture, it's actually a woman's reproductive organs. Her fallopian tubes, her uterus, her cervix, and her ovaries. So, for those of you who are big Dodge fans, go look at your car or your truck, and realize that you're driving around with a woman's uterus popping out of the hood. One of the issues that I alluded to a few minutes ago is ageism. Ageism is the institutionalized practice of discriminating against someone because of their age. So, an example is that the care for the elderly is inadequate. It's really hard when you have older family members to get people to come in and help. In a country that values older people, that would be a priority set by our government, but it's not. And interestingly, age is a status that changes throughout a person's life, whereas other statuses, such as race or gender, are fixed throughout your lifetime. So all of us, unless we die young, will know what it's like to be old. We all know what it's like to be a little kid. We all know what it's like to be a teenager, and we all know what it's like to be a young adult. Other age issues include age stratification, meaning some age groups have more power and better life opportunities than others. And again, we talked about how those who are middle aged tend to have way more financial control over things than people who are young or people who are old. And then another element is age cohort, the people who are born around the same time as you, in other words, your generation. They share the same historical experiences, including wars, technology, and economic fluctuations. So the people who were born from 1945 to 1963 are considered baby boomers. Then from 1964 to 1979, they are considered Generation X. And then those people who were born between 1980 and 2000, and most of you fall into this group, are called millennials. And again, there are stereotypes about each of these groups. Now, in the same way that we are socialized, we are also resocialized, meaning our existing social roles are radically altered or replaced, such as entering the military, going to prison, joining a cult, or becoming a monk. This resocialization process promotes group solidarity and a sense of belonging. You feel like the people standing next to you are your brothers or your sisters. Social control is exerted to break down the individual's old identity, and this is often done through punishment or hazing. Hazing is done in a fraternity or sorority, and people who go to jail oftentimes deal with the transformation from being a free citizen to an incarcerated citizen. And it serves to impose an ordeal that cements the seriousness and permanence of new roles and expectations. So when you enter the military, one of the first things they do is they cut your hair. And it is, again, a reflection of this new identity you are going to be taking on. Another aspect of resocialization is conversion. And this is a transformation of identity. And it often occurs with religion or politics. So if you are Methodist or Lutheran and you want to become Jewish or a Muslim, that's a conversion. Another kind of conversion is the political conversion, where Americans become fighters for terrorist groups. This woman is called Jihad Jane, and she was a nice, good old American girl who decided that what the United States was doing in the Middle East was wrong, and she put on the burqa and decided to be a terrorist. Another aspect of resocialization, and this is where you get into the darker side of things, is called brainwashing. And this is an extreme version of it. This is when a convert has their entire identity stripped and then they're resocialized. And you often see this with people who join cults, prisoners of war, hostages. These three pictures down here are all images from Jonestown, which in the late 1970s, early 1980s was a cult town, and it was led by Reverend Jim Jones, who's this guy right here, and it was basically a non-denominational Christian cult. However, Jim Jones, because he was using drugs and he had a god complex, he started doing really bad stuff. Well, then they became investigated by the US government. The representative in the Congress went down to this cult area to check it out. While he was down there, he was killed. A bunch of people in his party were killed, and Jim Jones convinced all of his followers, over 1,000 people, to literally drink the Kool-Aid, and that is where the term comes from. It was Kool-Aid laced with poison, and die because he felt that they were being persecuted. And again, you have people who were literally feeding their children Kool-Aid laced with poison so that they would all die together. And you have to have a serious lack of sense of self in order to do something like that. And cults are probably the thing that most of us have heard of but really don't know too much about. They recruit people, and they recruit people in a much different way than the army recruits people. The army will go on TV and say, have an adventure, join the army. Whereas cults tend to look for young adults who are socially isolated, who have difficulty with institutional expectations, specifically school or jobs, and who seem to be drifting and lacking in goals. The cult gives a person like that a sense of identity and replaces all of their old identity where they didn't like themselves and they didn't feel like they were worthy into somebody that is worthy. So you have a group like the Manson family where these young women and men, they were being given drugs all the time. They were told that Charles Manson was, the godlike figure, and they basically listened to whatever he told them to do, up to and including killing an entire family or two sets of families. Lastly, we're going to talk about Stockholm Syndrome. And this is something that often occurs with hostages and prisoners of war. And it's when a captive person begins to identify with the captor because they depend upon the captor for all their basic needs. Battered women also suffer from this syndrome. The idea here is that if somebody kidnaps you, throws you in a closet for a month, they are the only people you see, but they give you food, they let you use the bathroom, they make sure you have clean clothes, they're nice to you. You are at some point going to start to identify them as the good guy and not the bad guy. This is one of the most famous cases of the 1970s. Patty Hearst was kind of the Paris Hilton of her day. Very rich. She was kidnapped by a leftist group and kept in solitary confinement until she came to believe in the cause of the kidnappers. And she eventually joined them in robbing banks. And this is a picture of her robbing a bank, and it's actually superimposed over that red background. But they caught her on camera, and it became a big deal when she was caught about whether or not she was responsible for her actions. And she did, in fact, go to jail for a while. So, That ends this chapter. If you have any questions, please email or text me, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.